It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Tom Pope. He is an assistant professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's School of Computer Science and Engineering, and he's also a research assistant at the Aleph Institute for Artificial Intelligence, who you probably know from their work on the Semantic Scholar search engine. So he was a postdoctoral researcher in AI2, the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and the University of Washington, and he worked with Daniel Weld and Erich Horvitz. His work has received 4 Best Paper Awards, appeared in top venues, and covered by Nature and Science. He also has led a team at Intel to publish many research outputs. Tom, looking forward to your talk.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Great, so let me get started with a bit of history. So what you see here actually is the first ever scientific journal published back in the year 1665. So this journal published on just about anything from planets in outer space to whales in the ocean. So if you were a scientist looking for some scientific scholarly knowledge back then, that would be one of the only places to look. But of course, today, if you look at this landscape of scientific journals, as you well know, there's a complete explosion. Now, to find scientific knowledge nowadays, you'll use something like Google Scholar or Semantic Scholar, and you're much more likely to come up with this: millions of publications and authors coming from so many different journals and conferences and topics. Or generally, we have an explosion of scientific information, scientific knowledge bases, resources, code libraries, literature, of course, books, online discussions. And our human minds are inherently very limited in processing, finding, manipulating, synthesizing all this huge mountain of knowledge and information. As one example, take medical information overload. Over 1 million biomedical papers come out every year added to the PubMed search engine, which of course makes it extremely difficult for clinicians to keep up with very important evidence that can inform treatment and prevent mortality and other patient suffering. So in my work, I focus on developing computational methods for scientific knowledge discovery, taking all those vast and diverse sources of information and helping people in science, engineering, and medicine throughout all parts of their work, from creating ideas, running experiments and analyses, to making predictions and decisions. And to do that, I develop models and systems kind of touching on a full spectrum of research methodology, from creating new NLP, natural language processing data sets and tasks. And I know in the summer school, you've touched on this topic of natural language processing, machine learning models to work with all this information, user experiments, and user-facing systems to help people with discovery. Now, I also like to categorize my work into extraction, interaction, and prediction. So in terms of extraction, I'm thinking about structuring the literature with meaningful, useful representations. So just as an example of a few recent things we've been doing, we've been extracting all the different problems and all the different directions and hypotheses people have reported in biomedical literature. So taking millions of papers and automatically extracting problems, difficulties, limitations, uncertainties, and also things like future directions, hypotheses, surprising results. So for example, this can potentially enable researchers to ask, what don't we know in a specific area? Or what are some interesting directions at the edge of science? And by the way, you can use our model, which is on Hugging Face and GitHub, and also explore our search engine for this kind of information. A second thing we've recently been doing in terms of extraction is extracting combination therapies from papers. Combination therapies means combinations of drugs, which is often a vital part of cancer treatment, for example, and treatment of other diseases. And the goal here is, again, to allow clinicians to navigate this huge wealth of information and find the relative treatments they need effectively and efficiently. Now, in terms of interaction, which is a second theme I'm interested in, enabling new modes of interacting with the scientific literature to augment discovery. So think about Semantic Scholar, where I'm also employed, or Google Scholar, and pretty much any search engine. Still, the current way we interact with all this wealth of information is with keyword search engines, where we input some keywords and get back long lists of papers to read. Now, I'm interested in coming up with new modes of interaction with the scientific literature. So again, as a few examples, we've been developing network visualizations where you can explore things like, for example, drugs and their side effects or adverse outcomes of taking drugs. And you can look at the papers, you can explore characteristics of patients and interventions and see how this evolves over time. And more interestingly for me is this network visualization of groups of authors. So each node here that you see in this network is a cluster, automatically inferred cluster based on a co-authorship network, which I'm sure you've heard about at this stage of the summer school. So we cluster authors into groups that are kind of tightly knit and work together. And then we kind of create these edges between them. The green edges correspond to social affinity, which means that these two groups share some researchers in common. And the purple edges correspond to topical affinity, which means that two groups work on related topics. And then you can kind of dive deeper. You can click on a group and see who are the top authors in this group, what are the top things they work on, where do they work, in what universities and organizations. And of course, you can click further and see all the papers from a specific group. Now, we gave this visualization to scientists, and when they used our system, which we call SciSite, they were able to find all kinds of new perspectives and interesting groups by traversing these networks. So one example I like is a researcher in the US who was able to find a group working in an area that's very related to her, but publishing in different journals in different countries where she wouldn't usually look. And that work turned out to be impactful and also very relevant to her research. So this kind of connecting across silos using this network of co-authorship and a visualization of it. Another example related to what I was just saying with drug combinations. So here's another way of interacting with the literature. We allow clinicians to search for drugs, for genes, for mutations, for all kinds of diseases, and then help them build a plan of treatment based on combinations of drugs and evidence in the literature for the efficacy of those combinations. One last example I wanted to show you is of a search interface, or this is more like a modeling work toward a search interface, where you can highlight a specific part of a paper you're reading, and then find papers that are similar to that aspect. So let's say I want to find papers that are similar to the background of the paper I'm reading to do better literature review and understand what else is out there. Or maybe I want to find papers with similar results or similar experimental methods. So we built a model, NLP model that kind of is geared for this kind of search task. I won't go into the details, of course, but what I wanted to tell you is that you can access this model on Hugging Face and on GitHub. And this will allow you to get these document embeddings. I think you've also learned about that in the summer school. So textual embeddings, which are much more accurate than a lot of what else is out there for scientific document representations. Okay, and the last part of this kind of high-level overview of my work before I dive deeper into one specific area is my work on prediction. So a lot of what scientists do is leveraging existing knowledge to predict new knowledge. A lot of science is about making predictions, models and predictions. And I'm interested in augmenting that process by tapping into information in the literature. So one line of work is related to biomedical hypothesis generation, where we have these huge graphs or knowledge graphs of things like drugs, diseases, genes, proteins, side effects of drugs, etc., etc. And now we want to predict new links in these huge graphs. One of the applications that I'm interested in is drug repurposing, where you can think of this big graph of all the different drugs out there, all the different diseases out there, and then you have some edges between them when one drug is known to be able to treat a certain disease. But what if we can predict new ways in which a drug can be used? New uses against say, a different virus based on the same kind of drug mechanism, which is also known as off-label drug uses, and can cut a lot of costs in the very lengthy drug discovery process. So we have models that are able to make these predictions based on these knowledge graphs and also information from scientific literature. And finally, a last example of prediction, work I'm excited about very recently, where we take hospital patients in the ICU, the intensive care unit, and now we want to predict clinical risks. For example, what is their risk of mortality in the hospital during their stay at the ICU? And we do this by looking not only at their internal data in the electronic health medical records, which I'm sure you have heard of, but also by augmenting the internal information about each patient with information from PubMed, from the medical literature. So each patient, we're able to automatically find relevant papers to each specific individual patient. And then we have this kind of representation of a patient that's based on internal data, their background, their specific medications they've been taking, their specific complaints, but also external medical knowledge that comes from PubMed papers. And this is able to dramatically boost the predictive accuracy of these outcomes like mortality or length of hospital stay, all kinds of complications, dramatically able to improve accuracy versus the more kind of standard way of thinking about this, which is only trying to train some risk prediction model using internal hospital data without external scientific knowledge. Okay, so that was kind of an overview part of my work. And the remaining time, I wanted to dive deeper into one specific paper that will also touch on different aspects of my work. And this is from CHI 2022, which is a human-computer interaction conference, to those of you who have not heard of this. And this work is about bursting scientific filter bubbles and boosting innovation by novel author discovery. So as you surely know, science is overwhelmingly fragmented. We have these kind of bubbles and silos of information. And it's increasingly hard for us as individual researchers to discover ideas outside our kind of narrow bubbles. So the goal in this project is to connect scholars to peers who spark ideas for interesting new research directions. So to take an example of something that's doing quite the opposite, you can look at all these apps for recommending people to speak to in scientific conferences. There's all kinds of applications. Some of them are more popular than others. And then you can browse attendees, see all the different things they work on. For example, you can see more people interested in machine learning, But the problem with this kind of approach is it's kind of recommending more of the same. It's going to show you more people who are interested in what you are already familiar with. What we're interested in this project is in automatically finding people who spark ideas for new methods you can apply to your work, or new problems you can look into, or new resources and data sets you can use. Things that are both relevant to your work, but also new and novel, inspiring new thoughts and new directions. And the way we do this is with an approach I call commonalities and contrasts. So for the commonalities, we first take a specific author, let's say Dan. We take all of Dan's papers and we automatically extract, using NLP, all the different methods Dan has applied in his papers and all the different tasks or problems. And now we can find other authors, other peers, who share similar kind of aspects or items along one of these dimensions. So for example, we can find more peers who work on similar related tasks to Dan, but also use very different methods. So this is an author who works on similar things, but uses very different methods, and that can inspire Dan for new methods that he can bring in to inform his work and explore new ways to solve his tasks. Now, another important kind of structural connection and observation that we need to make is that researchers have many hats. They kind of have multiple personas, different themes or different lines of work, depending on who you work with and what you're working on and at what time at your career. So authors have these different personas, and we want to capture those. So for example, for Dan, one of Dan's areas is NLP and language models. And then we can see, and this is a real output from our system, which I'll show you in the next few slides. We can see Dan's papers for this specific persona of Dan. But Dan also has another hat, another persona, explainable AI and human-computer interaction. And this corresponds to different papers that Dan works on. So the way we construct those personas, which, as I said, are real examples from our system, is by taking Dan's papers and embedding them without going into the details here, so that we can cluster papers into similar subsets. So we can take Dan's papers and then find all of the papers that are related to NLP language models, and then all of the ones related to explainable AI and human-computer interaction. And this gives us a kind of matrix, an author matrix, where the rows of this matrix correspond to papers. The columns correspond to these aspects or facets, things like tasks, methods, data sets. Then the intersection, or these kind of slices, correspond to personas, so the subset of papers that Dan has worked on in NLP, for example. And then the specific tasks or specific data sets that Dan has been looking into in that subset of papers. So all the NLP tasks in Dan's NLP papers, or all the NLP data sets in that subset of papers. And now that we have this kind of representation of an author as a matrix and these slices, we can now find similar authors, right? So going back to our example, we can now find authors who have similar tasks, but also authors who have distant methods. And this kind of retrieval of similar authors along specific dimensions and distant along others is what allows us to surface new ideas, new topics that other people have been working on. So we take this approach and we implemented in a system which we call Bridger, which is a system for discovering authors and their directions. So each author is represented as a kind of card where you can click this card and then see all the different things they're working on. You can search within it. You can look at the different tasks that they work on, the different papers, and then you can control what type of author recommendation you want to see. Do you want to see authors who are similar to you in terms of the task, or do you want to see authors who are distant to you in terms of the task, but similar in terms of the methods they use? And this is a system that we build, and then we give this to users in a user study. So we recruit 20 computer science researchers, ranging from graduate students to full professors. We pull their papers from Semantic Scholar automatically, and then we compare Bridger to the kind of state-of-the-art neural retrieval model that Semantic Scholar currently uses to surface papers and to surface authors. And this system is kind of more of a standard search engine algorithm. It's meant more for surfacing highly relevant, similar results. It's not meant for expanding your horizons and showing you people or directions that are similar to you along one dimension, but very different and surprising along another. So users in our study saw something like this. Let's say Dan is the user. So Dan sees a list of recommended author cards, and different personas of Dan, different subsets of Dan's papers would show different recommendations. For example, authors related more to NLP or authors related more to human-computer interaction. And then we attach these kind of item checkboxes to all these different facets, like all the different tasks, all the different methods, data sets, and of course, authors. And we ask the user, in this case, Dan, to check these checkboxes whenever they see something that's interesting for forming new and relevant research directions. So if Dan thinks that, for example, network analysis and science of science is interesting to inform his directions, he would click that. So this is what the interface looks like in our system. You can see here also, by the way, that we don't show names of authors, we don't show affiliations. And I'm wondering, actually, as a question to you, if you can think of why we don't show those things in this evaluation. Anyone got any ideas? Okay, so
probably will bias the results.
Yes,
Prestige bias, as Meng says.
that's correct, Daniel. Yeah, yes, exactly, right. So
Meng cheat with
right, yeah, exactly. So you know, you're trying to judge if something is interesting inherently, but then if I show you an author and their name, the name already can bias you. Then if I show you the affiliation, you know, can be a very well-known organization, or it can be a lesser-known organization, and that can affect your decisions whether something is new and relevant. So you want to decouple those things and remove those confounders. Now, in terms of what we were able to achieve with this, so first of all, 80% of researchers prefer this approach of commonalities and contrast that I showed you for discovering authors who are not only relevant, but also spark ideas for new research directions. So they prefer this approach to the more standard search, neural search, which Google Scholar, Semantic Scholar, PubMed, everyone will use in different ways. Secondly, that persona-based representation of authors, which is another one of our contributions, also significantly increased people's preference results. People like to have the control of seeing recommendations along different aspects, similar to a subset of their work, and not just combining everything. And finally, the result I'm most excited about, and in a sense is most related to the Science of Science summer school, is that when we look at our recommendations and we compare them to what you would get with Semantic Scholar, for example, so we see that our recommended authors publish in very different venues, or they are cited by very different venues than what the user usually publishes in, or what the user usually cites themselves. So what you see here on the left is plots showing distance metrics between the user and between recommended authors. And you can see that with our approach with commonalities and contrasts. For example, the distance in terms of the citation graph is much larger for our approach than what you get with Semantic Scholar. Or distances in the co-authorship network between the user and the recommended authors by our system versus Semantic Scholar. Our distances are much larger. The authors we recommend also published in very different venues than where the user usually publishes. And again, this is not simply increasing the distance, we're also maintaining relevance. We have this, the same or greater relevance than what the standard search engine has, but with much more surprising and interesting recommendations. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by just connecting back actually to the NLP and the extraction and the search challenges that I showed you earlier, and showing you how they apply to this specific project. So one challenge that I kind of skimmed over completely is that finding these similar things is actually very far from trivial. So if you want to measure similarity between misinformation and false information, or science of science and quantitative studies of science, maybe to us as humans, that's pretty trivial. But actually, for current state-of-the-art NLP, this is very hard. And measuring semantic similarity is very far from being a solved task. The same goes for dissimilarity. Dissimilarity, so we can find distant methods. It's kind of the flip side of the same coin. Very hard to do currently. So we have some work toward this, a very hard problem. This is a kind of very NLP focused work, where we create a new data set and a new task where the goal is to learn to link diverse scientific concepts across the literature. So for example, we want to be able to tell that self-driving cars, which appears in one paper, and then autonomous vehicles, which is mentioned in another paper, that these two things refer to the same concept. We also want to be able to tell that, for example, image generation is a kind of child concept of the more general computer vision. So this is very far from being solved, but at least now we have an initial data set where we can train models and also measure progress. And this data set and models trained on it are available online on Hugging Face and GitHub as well. And lastly, for another challenge that came up in this project is the very complicated, technical, unfamiliar jargon that we encounter when we see new researchers. And of course, the more distant an author is to you, if the author comes from a very different domain, on the one hand, that's going to be the most promising for the kind of big breakthroughs connecting across distant areas. That's where we most want to foster collaboration. But on the other hand, the barrier to understanding what novel authors do is going to be much, much harder to break, because the effort it will require from us as users to understand all kinds of acronyms and new concepts from a completely different field is going to be so much harder. So again, very hard problem. We have some initial work toward this, where again, we focus on NLP models here, and we're learning to generate personalized concept definitions grounded in what the reader of some paper already knows. So for example, let's say you have this target concept you encountered in some paper, multi-RC. Doesn't matter what it means. Now we look for all the papers that mention multi-RC. And now our system, which we call Accord, finds all these different definitions of the sentence. And we look for the definitions that are grounded in concepts that the user already knows. For example, in Semantic Scholar, we know the papers users have written, users have read previously. We can estimate what users already know. So for example, they may know the squad dataset, which is a big dataset in NLP. And now we can generate these kind of personalized relational definitions, defining a new concept in terms of concepts a user already knows. Okay, so that really kind of connects back to my general theme of how do we take all these different diverse sources of knowledge in the literature and knowledge bases and help researchers and practitioners across all the different parts of their work. And I've showed you samples of work that touch on different parts of this pipeline, helping people come up with ideas, helping make biomedical predictions. And of course, there's a lot of work remaining to be done in this very challenging space. So with that, I'll conclude and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Tom. Very, very exciting and wide-ranging array of tasks. So let's thank Tom for this awesome presentation. They're doing really pioneer job working this. So if there are questions, please, as always, I don't have to repeat, but just unmute and show your, ideally, your camera.
Hi, Tom. This is Han from Syracuse University. I do have one question that I'm really amazed by the knowledge discovery, that technique you are trying to develop. But I'm too curious. Do you think is that possible? We have a target, like we solve which famous problem in science or physics or math or biology, and we develop techniques that we can facilitate or automate the discovery to solve this problem. Do you think that's possible, or we just develop some general method to help or assist researchers to solve scientific problems?
Yeah, I think those are not mutually exclusive, because it's kind of like generally helping the community gradually do better discovery, be more aware of what's out there, be exposed to new ideas, not trying to completely automate the process of discovery, but enabling humans to do better scientific work, where of course most of the scientific work will still be up to the human and not to the AI, but the systems that we build will allow the kind of scientific network to gradually become more diverse, connecting different areas, making it easier to find what you're looking for, making it easier to perhaps suggest new directions to look into, to prioritize, and also to help practitioners make decisions and predictions about patients or about what's the next experiment I want to run in my lab. So that's kind of the human-centered aspect of this work. I also think that you, of course, could look at specific targeted scientific problems. And a lot of what I've been discussing, like in the clinical space or in the biomedical knowledge graph space, directly translates into very important kind of fundamental problems. So just to give an example that a lot of you have, of course, heard of, AlphaFold, protein folding, based on predicting protein structures from a lot of protein data. So you can think of that as a very specific case of having a scientific database and trying to predict some target based on that. But that is done in isolation of all the rich, huge wealth of knowledge and information that exists in millions of papers, in knowledge bases with all kinds of diverse aspects of the problem. So you can think of taking specific important problems in science and in the future, hopefully, being able to dynamically find the most useful information out there that can help you solve a specific problem more accurately. So I hope that kind of clarifies the distinction between an automated system that can find information and then perform some specific task better, to enabling humans to be more creative and navigate huge amounts of information.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question. Thanks so much for your great talk, Tom. I was just wondering generally if you could say a little more about the roles that you see recommendation engines playing in the lives of academics going into the future. I think in many of the examples and the vignettes that you showed, many of the users are academics themselves, but I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about whether or not systems like these could be used within research institutes for making, for example, to help promote successful academic matchmaking. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, great question. I do think about that a lot. We also have this kind of a perspective paper recently up on Archive that summarizes a lot of our thinking and future thoughts. It's called A Computational Inflection for Scientific Discovery. But to answer your question with some specific examples, so yeah, you can think of, in a sense, it's related to the previous question. I like to think about this as breaking down the scientific process and research process, and also kind of practitioners' process when the practitioner is involved in science in some way or requires scientific knowledge. I like to break it down into kind of tasks. You know, so you have the task of ideation, of thinking of a new direction. You have the task of coming up with all kinds of related work to kind of position your direction. You have tasks of literature review. You have the problems of making predictions, of designing experiments and evaluations. You can break this down in all kinds of ways. And then the way I try to approach this in the long-term vision is, can we design systems that retrieve knowledge and synthesize knowledge from the huge universe of scientific knowledge in a way that's kind of targeted to each specific task? So to take one of your examples, you mentioned collaboration, academic matchmaking. So that's a type of task of that's somewhere in between ideation, you know, thinking of new directions, new potential projects. It's also about facilitating collaboration and teamwork. And how do you do that? So how can I retrieve authors who are relevant to you, authors who match you along specific dimensions? You can also then think of all kinds of assistants that follow your interaction with an author. For example, an assistant that kind of you add to your Slack channels and kind of sees what you're speaking about and suggests new papers to work on, or new papers to read, or maybe identify certain pitfalls in a current direction and recommends you should look at. So this sounds a bit futuristic, but that's the kind of thinking that I like to guide myself with, looking ahead about how these systems can be used. They can also be used by policymakers, kind of mapping science, mapping what are the areas where we are currently having problems in, what are the areas where we have uncertainty, so that funding can perhaps be guided to those specific areas where research is more needed. So a lot of different uses for these kind of retrieval and extraction and prediction systems.
Fantastic, thank you.
So we still have some minutes for questions. I know that Meng, you posted a comment, so if you want to maybe
I can read
describe.
Okay.
So I guess I can read it so that it's recorded.
Yeah,
so, Meng Liu asked. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I've read it. Do you want to read it like for others? I've read it.
Yeah, out loud. Like, yeah, like what is the some
sure.
definition of what you mean by Wood way of discovering latent concepts with NLP?
Yeah, maybe
recommendations on how to capture. Yeah, go ahead, Meng.
Sorry about that. I was just hoping like my texting might be more coherent than my speaking. Anyway, so I'm just interested in discovering sort of latent constructs in textual data. For example, I'm interested in the discourse of open science, and this can be understood as a latent construct. By this, I mean that people can talk about other concepts that are relevant to it or related to it, but without mentioning the term itself. So for example, people talk about replication and other things, but the term open science per se is not mentioned in the entire text. So I wonder whether there is any sort of recommendation on how to examine or capture those kind of things.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the short answer is it's very far from solved. So I don't think any specific model will give you what you're looking for with high quality. Of course, there are all kinds of clustering approaches, right, that supposedly in theory could uncover latent topics that are interrelated, but anyone who's used them knows that they don't really work at the moment well enough. So what I can point to is our, for example, work on, can you see my pointer, by the way, my cursor when I'm, okay, so yes. We have this work, right, which is related to co-reference of concepts, right? So in a sense, it's related to what you're saying. We're trying to find these latent concepts where all these different diverse mentions in the text kind of map to the same concept, right? So computer vision and visual AI, visual understanding. Is that exactly the same? I don't know, but it probably maps to the same underlying concept. Or, self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles, right? So cars and vehicles, not exactly the same, right, if you're strictly speaking, but you want to map them to the same concept. Now, these are already hard to do. The things you're mentioning, like linking things to open science, which is a very abstract concept, is going to be probably harder. Another thing in our work is about the hierarchy, right? So I would say that replication, in a sense, maybe falls under open science in a certain aspect, or at least there's some overlap there. So that's one relation to my work. A second relation is to our document embeddings in this model we called Aspire, where, at least as far as we know, currently we have probably the best way at the moment to cluster scientific documents based on these latent kind of representations. So we have embeddings of papers, neural embeddings that are learned in a certain way to map between similar scientific language. So, for example, one way we train our model is looking at sentences that co-cite, let's say, two different papers. And now there can be all kinds of shared aspects between two papers that are cited together. For example, they can both speak about open science or replication, but because they're written by different authors, they will often use different language. But based on the citation signal, we can now inject this kind of external knowledge that gives us reason to believe that these two texts are similar. And really, we're able to improve results quite a lot in terms of clustering scientific texts. So that's another way to look at this clustering, or this problem of co-reference and inferring ontologies and hierarchies and knowledge bases of all these concepts automatically. All these things that I've discussed are related to what you're saying. But yeah, it's currently very far from being a solved problem, especially if you want to infer like these implicit, latent connections that are not explicitly mentioned in any specific text. That requires a very deep degree of scientific understanding from the model and rich kind of semantic meaning representations that will know that even if something is not explicitly mentioned in the text, that it's referring to open science, for example. So yeah, so I don't know if that helps you, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, but lots of interesting ideas. I'll definitely look up the literature a little bit more. So thank you.
Great.
Okay, so and with that, let's thank Tom for his presentation. Thank you so much, Tom, for taking the time. And again, Tom will be also a mentor today in the afternoon, at least Eastern time. So thanks, Tom, and looking forward to the future of the work.